The scorching summer sun beat down on the dusty plains of Willow Creek Valley as three black pickup trucks rumbled down the dirt road towards Samuel Miller's farmstead. The men inside, members of the notorious Blackwater Gang, couldn't have known that the old farmer laboriously tending to his cornfield, the one whose weathered hands shook from what they assumed was age and fatigue, was once the most decorated Navy SEAL in Persian Gulf history, with confirmed operations that remained, classified to this day. Their fatal mistake would cost them everything they held dear. Before we dive deeper into this extraordinary tale of courage and redemption, let us know where you're watching from. And if this story touches your heart, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow we've got something truly special lined up for you. The year was 2023, and the Southwest was suffering through its worst drought in recorded history. Water had become more precious than gold, and the Blackwater Gang had spent the past 6 months systematically taking over small farms across 3 states, using their water rights to build a criminal empire. Their leader, Marcus "Deadeye" Davidson, stood 6'4", with a jagged scar crossing his right cheek, a souvenir from a prison riot where he'd killed 3 men with his bare hands. His younger brother, Ray, rode shotgun, absently cleaning his chrome-plated Desert Eagle, a weapon that had already claimed 8 lives during their campaign of terror. Behind them, their 4 most trusted enforcers followed in separate vehicles, each man carrying enough firepower to take on a small police force. The gang had chosen Samuel Miller's farm carefully. It sat on top of one of the region's largest underground aquifers, and with the local sheriff's department stretched thin across hundreds of miles of rural territory, it was the perfect target. As they approached the property, Marcus noticed the old farmer working his fields under the merciless sun. Miller's movements were slow, deliberate, his hands visibly shaking as he checked his corn crops. His faded denim overalls and sweat-stained workshirt spoke of decades of honest labor, while his slight limp suggested years of hard living had taken their toll. "Look at that old-timer," Ray sneered, holstering his pistol. "Bastard can barely stand up straight. Probably been drinking away his sorrows since his wife died." The information came from their usual reconnaissance. Betty Miller had passed 3 years ago, leaving Samuel alone on the sprawling 300-acre farm. Marcus said nothing, studying the farmer with the predatory instinct that had kept him alive through 15 years in maximum security. Something about the way Miller moved nagged at his instincts. Despite the apparent tremor in his hands and his labored gait, there was an economy to his movements, a precision that seemed at odds with his apparent frailty. The old farmer, Samuel, Silent Sam Miller, didn't react as the trucks pulled up to his property line. His 1,000-yard stare remained fixed on the withering cornstalks before him, but his mind was already calculating distances, angles, and potential fields of fire. The tremors in his hands, which hadn't stopped since his last mission in the Gulf, steadied almost imperceptibly as decades of training kicked in. Inside the farmhouse, a worn shoebox lay hidden beneath loose floorboards in the master bedroom. It contained medals Miller never displayed, including a Navy Cross that the history books would never mention. Beneath the medals lay documentation of operations so classified that even now, 30 years later, their mere existence was denied by the highest levels of government. Young Tommy Martinez, Miller's part-time farmhand, watched the approaching trucks from the relative safety of the barn. The 16-year-old was one of the few people who knew pieces of Miller's past, having discovered a hidden compartment in the barn last spring while stacking hay. Inside, he'd found a maintenance manual for specialized military equipment and a faded photograph of a younger Miller with his SEAL team. When confronted, Miller had made the boy promise to keep his secret, sharing only enough stories to impress upon Tommy the importance of discretion. As the Blackwater Gang's trucks came to a stop in front of his property, Miller continued his methodical inspection of the corn, his movements deliberately slow and unthreatening. The irrigation pipes he was checking were running dry. The drought had hit everyone hard, but he knew the aquifer beneath his land was still flowing strong. It was why they were here after all. Water meant power in these desperate times. "Hey, old-timer," Ray's voice carried across the field, thick with mock friendliness. "Got a business proposition for you." Miller kept working, his weathered hands moving along the dry stalks while his mind catalogued every detail of the unfolding situation. 6 men, heavily armed, overconfident. The nearest help was at least 30 minutes away, assuming anyone even realized there was trouble. He'd faced worse odds in places whose names would never appear in any record, but that had been decades ago, when his hands didn't shake and his left knee could still handle a full sprint. Behind him, he heard car doors slam and boots hit the dirt. The steady crunch of approaching footsteps told him the gang was spreading out, attempting to flank him. Amateur move. They were silhouetting themselves against the horizon, making easy targets. Not that they could know that. To them, he was just another struggling farmer, a relic of a dying way of life, about to be washed away by the cruel tides of change. Tommy, hidden in the barn's shadows, reached for his cell phone, ready to call for help. Miller had made him memorize a specific sequence of numbers months ago, just in case. The boy's hand froze as he caught Miller's subtle headshake. A gesture so slight it would have been invisible to anyone who hadn't spent hundreds of hours working alongside the old farmer. The gang members couldn't have known they were walking into the kill zone of a man who had spent years perfecting the art of defensive warfare. They couldn't have known that every structure on Miller's property had been carefully positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire, or that the seemingly random arrangement of farm equipment created a perfect series of choke points. They were about to learn that sometimes the deadliest predators are the ones that look the most harmless. Marcus Davidson closed the distance to Miller, his boots kicking up dust from the drought-hardened earth. The gang leader's shadow fell across the withered cornstalks, casting a dark presence over Miller's careful inspection of the irrigation lines. Behind him, Ray fingered his Desert Eagle, while the other 4 men, Cole, Jackson, Viper, and Dutch, spread out in a practiced formation that had served them well in dozens of previous takeovers. "Word is you're sitting on the biggest aquifer in 3 counties, Marcus said, his voice carrying the gravel undertone of too many cigarettes and desert nights. "Way I see it, that's too much water for one old man to manage, especially these days." He gestured at the failing crops around them, the cornstalks brown and brittle in the relentless sun. Miller straightened slowly, his movements deliberate and measured. His hands trembled as he wiped sweat from his forehead with a faded bandana, but his eyes, when he finally turned to face the gang, held a clarity that made Marcus pause. They were the eyes of a man who had seen things that couldn't be unseen, who had made peace with horrors that would break most men. "My water rights are registered with the county," Miller said quietly, his voice barely carrying over the hot wind that rustled the dying corn. "I've been in my family for 3 generations. His accent carried traces of his Mississippi Delta upbringing, softened by years of military discipline and global deployments that his visitors couldn't have known about. Ray laughed, the sound sharp and ugly in the afternoon heat. "County ain't what it used to be, old-timer. Sheriff's got 2 deputies covering 500 square miles. Way I hear it, response time out here's about 40 minutes. He paused, grinning. "On a good day." The other gang members had completed their encirclement, taking positions that would have been tactically sound against an ordinary farmer. Miller noted their positions with the automatic assessment of a man who had spent years planning ambushes and counter-ambushes. Cole and Jackson were by the trucks, maintaining their escape route. Viper had moved to cover the barn's main entrance, while Dutch had positioned himself near the house's back door. Tommy watched from his hidden position in the barn's hayloft, his heart pounding. Through gaps in the weathered boards, he could see everything. He knew what Miller was capable of, had seen him hit impossible targets during their secret shooting sessions in the back 40, had helped maintain the carefully concealed caches of equipment hidden around the property. But there were 6 of them, all armed, all looking like they meant business. "Here's how this plays out," Marcus continued, pulling a thick envelope from his jacket. "We're offering fair market value for the property, 30 cents on the dollar, given the current climate." His scarred face twisted into what might have been meant as a reassuring smile, more than generous considering the alternatives. Miller's trembling hands moved to adjust his work gloves, a motion that concealed his assessment of the weapons they carried. AR-15 variants mostly, with some higher-end modifications. Ray's Desert Eagle was for show, but the others carried serious hardware, professional equipment, if not professional operators. "My wife is buried on this land," Miller said, his voice still quiet but carrying an edge that made Marcus's predatory instincts twitch. "Sarah loved this farm more than anything, told me to keep it running no matter what. Dead wife ain't gonna help you irrigate these fields," Ray snapped, his patience visibly thinning. "Ain't gonna help you make loan payments neither. Way we—" "Hear it, bank's been sniffing around already." Miller didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked past the gang members to where the afternoon sun was casting long shadows across his property. The wind had picked up, sending dust devils dancing between the corn rows. To the untrained eye, he appeared to be lost in thought, perhaps considering their offer. In reality, he was making final wind calculations and mapping out firing angles. "Those are nice rifles you boys are carrying," Miller observed mildly, his trembling hands now clasped before him. "AR-15s, looks like. EOTech sights on most of them. Expensive setup." The comment caught Marcus off guard. Most farmers in these parts knew their hunting rifles and shotguns, but Miller's assessment was surprisingly technical. "You know your weapons." "Old man, picked up a thing or two over the years," Miller replied, his gaze drifting to the barn where he knew Tommy was watching. The boy had been helping him maintain his equipment for months now, learning skills that Miller had hoped would never be needed again. "Served a bit back in the day, nothing special." Ray snorted, clearly unimpressed. "Yeah? What branch, Gramps, Army cook, Air Force pencil pusher?" Miller's hands continued their constant tremor as he replied, "Navy." The word carried no emphasis, no hint of the thousands of hours of specialized training, the countless classified operations, the medals locked away beneath his floorboards. To the gang, it was just another piece of background noise, irrelevant to their current operation. "Well, sailor," Marcus said, his tone hardening, "time's about up. Take the offer, or things get complicated." He gestured at the dying crops around. "Them. Ain't like you're making this land work anyway. Way I see it, we're doing you a favor." The wind gusted again, stronger this time, carrying with it the promise of a storm building in the distant mountains. Miller's eyes tracked the movement. Of the dust it kicked up, his mind automatically calculating windage adjustments out of decades-old habit. The tremors in his hands were becoming less pronounced, just as they always did when combat became inevitable. The gang members couldn't have known they were standing exactly where Miller had placed survey markers months ago, their distances carefully measured and recorded. They couldn't have known that what looked like random farm equipment and storage containers had been positioned to provide perfect cover and concealment. They were about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous ground is the kind that's been prepared by someone who knows exactly what they're doing. "You boys might want to step back a bit," Miller said softly, his trembling hands now resting at his sides. "Rattlers love this kind of weather. Heat gets them moving, especially near the irrigation pipes." The warning wasn't entirely a lie. There were indeed snakes on his property, but they weren't what concerned him at the moment. Ray took an involuntary step backward, his eyes darting to the ground, while Marcus maintained his position, studying Miller with growing suspicion. The gang leader had survived too many dangerous situations to ignore the subtle warning signs his instincts were sending him. Something about the old farmer's stance, the way his trembling seemed to lessen rather than increase under pressure, wasn't adding up. Through the barn's weathered slats, Tommy watched the scene unfold, his hand still hovering over his phone. He remembered the first time he'd discovered who Miller really was, 6 months ago during a spring storm that had damaged part of the barn's roof. They'd been moving old equipment when Tommy had accidentally triggered a hidden compartment in what he'd thought was just another storage locker. Inside, he'd found not just the military equipment and photographs, but a logbook filled with entries that read like something out of an action movie. Miller had caught him before he could read too much, but the old farmer had recognized something in the boy. A trustworthiness, perhaps, or simply the need for someone to finally know the truth. Back in '91, Miller had told him that day, his hands shaking as he made them both hot chocolate, I was part of a team tasked with something that never officially happened, something that saved a lot of lives but couldn't ever go in the history books. He'd shown Tommy his medals then, explaining how each one came with a price that went beyond physical scars. Now, watching Miller face down 6 armed men, Tommy understood why the old farmer had spent the last 6 months teaching him things that seemed odd at the time. How to read wind patterns, how to maintain communication equipment, how to move quietly through the farm's various buildings. Miller had been preparing for something like this. Tell you what, Marcus said, breaking the tense silence. Let's make this real simple. Sign these papers now. We'll let you stay on as a tenant. Work the land for us, keep a roof over your head. Fair deal, considering the alternatives. His hand rested casually on his holstered pistol, the threat clear but unstated. Miller's eyes tracked the subtle movements of the other gang members. Dutch had edged closer to the house, while Viper maintained his position near the barn. Cole and Jackson were getting restless by the trucks, the heat and tension wearing on their nerves. His years of combat experience told him they were approaching a tipping point. Soon, someone would make a move that couldn't be taken back. Had a friend in the service, Miller said, his voice carrying clearly in the hot afternoon air. Mike Dawson, sniper instructor out of Little Creek, taught me something important about moments like this. His trembling hands moved to adjust. His work gloves again, a motion that looked natural but served to position them closer to his sides. That right. Marcus's voice carried a dangerous edge now. And what's that, old-timer? Said the most dangerous people aren't the ones who want to fight. They're the ones who know how to fight, but choose not to, right up until they have no choice left. Miller's eyes, which had been focused on Marcus, shifted slightly to the left, picking up Ray's increasingly agitated movements. The younger Davidson brother had grown tired of the conversation. Enough of this philosophical bullshit, he snarled, his hand moving to his Desert Eagle. Sign the papers or we start breaking things, starting with those arthritic fingers of yours. Miller sighed, a sound that carried more resignation than fear. 3 years ago, he said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, forcing them to lean in slightly to hear him. My Sarah made me promise to keep this farm running. Made me swear on her deathbed that I wouldn't let anyone take it. Thing about promises like that, they weigh on you, change the math of what you're willing to do. Tommy tensed in his hiding spot, recognizing the shift in Miller's tone. He'd heard it once before, when a pair of drug addicts had tried to break into the farm storage sheds. Miller had handled that situation without violence, but the boy had seen a glimpse then of what the old farmer was capable of. Last chance, Marcus announced, his patience visibly wearing thin. Ray here's got a quick temper, and I'd hate to. You see this get messy. Way I figure you got about 10 seconds to make the smart choice. Miller's hands had almost stopped shaking now, though only Tommy would have noticed the change. The old farmer's voice remained calm, almost conversational, as he replied, You figure wrong, son. I've already made my choice. Made it 3 years ago, standing by my wife's grave. Question is, Have you boys thought through your choices? The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Ray's fingers twitched near his Desert Eagle, while the other gang members shifted their positions slightly, sensing the situation was about to break one way or another. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie stillness broken only by the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. "You're either brave or stupid, old man," Marcus growled, his hand now fully resting on his holstered weapon. "Either way, time's up. Ray, show him we mean business. Nothing permanent, yet. Just make sure he understands the situation." Miller watched Ray advance, noting how the younger man's eagerness made him sloppy, disrupting the gang's carefully maintained formation. Everything that was about to happen would flow from that first mistake, that first breakdown in their tactical positioning. His trembling hands steadied completely as he prepared himself for what had become inevitable. They couldn't have known that what looked like an old farmer's nervous tremor was actually the result of nerve damage from a classified operation in the Persian Gulf. Damage sustained while saving his entire team from an ambush that officially never happened. They were about to learn that sometimes the deadliest predators are the ones who've learned to live with their scars. Ray Davidson moved toward Miller with the cocky swagger of a man who had never faced a real opponent, his chrome Desert Eagle catching the sunlight as he drew it from his holster. The younger Davidson's first mistake was focusing on the old farmer's trembling hands rather than his eyes. Eyes that had gone cold and calculating, tracking every movement with predator-like precision. "How about we start with that bum knee of yours?" Ray taunted, gesturing with his pistol. "Saw you limping earlier. Bet that'll hurt something fierce when I—" Miller's movement was so smooth, so unexpected, that for a moment everyone simply stared. One trembling hand had swept up and out, catching Ray's gun arm at a precise angle that used the younger man's own momentum against him. The Desert Eagle went flying, and before it hit the ground, Ray found himself face down in the dust, his arm locked behind him at an angle that sent white-hot pain shooting through his shoulder. "Son," Miller said quietly, his knee planted firmly. "In the small of Ray's back, there's still time to walk away from this." His hands had stopped shaking entirely now, each movement precise and controlled. Marcus's reaction was instant, his own weapon clearing its holster. "Let him go, old man, or this ends badly for everyone." Behind him, the other gang members raised their rifles, creating a circle of death around Miller and his captive. Tommy watched from the barn, his heart pounding. He'd seen Miller move like this once during their training sessions, when the old farmer was demonstrating a defensive technique. But this was different. This was the real thing, and the stakes were life and death. "See that container over." "And there," Miller asked, nodding toward what appeared to be an ordinary shipping container about 50 yards away. "The green one just past the tractor?" His voice remained calm, almost conversational, despite the multiple weapons aimed at him. Marcus didn't take his eyes off Miller, but he could see the container in his peripheral vision. "What about it?" "Inside that container is enough evidence to put your whole operation away for 20 years. Photos, documentation, recordings, everything the FBI needs to dismantle your water theft ring across 3 states. Miller's grip on Ray hadn't loosened. "Been watching you boys for months now. Wasn't hard to figure out your pattern." A bead of sweat rolled down Marcus's forehead. "You expect us to believe some old farmer's been running counter-surveillance, playing detective. In his spare time, 40 meters to your left," Miller continued as if Marcus hadn't spoken. "Behind that stack of hay bales, there's a cellular signal booster connected to a satellite uplink. Everything happening right now is being recorded and uploaded to secure servers. Kill me, and it all goes to every law enforcement agency in the Southwest." The gang members exchanged uncertain glances. This wasn't how these situations usually played out. Farmers they'd confronted in the past had either caved immediately or tried ineffective resistance that was quickly subdued. None had displayed this level of preparation or tactical awareness. "You're bluffing," Marcus growled, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. "Third compartment of my tool shed," Miller replied. "There's a laptop with GPS data showing every property you've taken over in the last 6 months, including the coordinates where you buried James Fletcher when he refused to sell his ranch in Mesa County." The color drained from Marcus's face. The Fletcher murder wasn't public knowledge. They'd been careful to make it look like the old rancher had simply abandoned his property. "How did you—" Marcus caught himself, his finger tightening on his trigger. "Same way I know about the meeting you've got scheduled next week with the Chinese buyers interested in purchasing water rights. Same way I know about the offshore accounts where you're storing the proceeds." Miller's voice hardened slightly. "Same way I learned to handle men like you in places I'm still not allowed to talk about." Tommy watched in amazement as doubt crept across the faces of the gang members. He knew some of what Miller was saying was true. He'd helped set up some of the surveillance equipment himself, but he suspected the old farmer was also playing a psychological game, using their own paranoia against them. "Dutch!" Marcus barked. "Check that container. Cole, look behind those hay bales." His gun remained trained on Miller, but his previous confidence had cracked. "I wouldn't," Miller warned. "That whole area's under surveillance. Move toward either location and things get complicated." His hands, still locked around Ray's arm, hadn't trembled once in the past few minutes. The afternoon heat seemed to intensify as the standoff continued. Ray squirmed under Miller's grip, but quickly stopped when the slightest pressure sent another jolt of pain through his shoulder. The other gang members held their positions, weapons ready, but uncertainty clear in their stances. "Way I see it," Miller continued, "you boys have about 2 minutes to make a choice. The satellite uplink I mentioned? It's set to automatically transmit everything if I don't enter a code every 3 minutes. Dead man's switch, military grade, time's ticking." Marcus's mind raced, trying to separate truth from bluff. The old farmer knew too many details to be making everything up, but if he really had all this evidence, why hadn't he turned them in already? Then again, if he was lying, how did he know about Fletcher and the Chinese buyers? "Got some interesting footage of your operation down in Texas, too," Miller added casually. "That business with the county commissioner, the one who suddenly changed his vote on water rights after his daughter had that accident. Imagine that. Would interest quite a few people." A bead of sweat rolled down Marcus's temple as he realized they were dealing with something far more dangerous than a simple farmer. They were facing someone who had been watching them, studying them, and preparing for this confrontation with military precision. The trembling hands that had made them dismiss him as harmless now seemed like a clever piece of misdirection, a warrior's camouflage hiding in plain sight. 1 minute left, Miller announced, his voice carrying the same calm authority that had once guided his SEAL team through countless high-stakes operations. "Tick-tock, boys!" His grip on Ray remained precise, a textbook control hold that he could maintain for hours if necessary. Marcus Davidson's mind raced through scenarios, each one worse than the last. If the old farmer was bluffing, they could end this quickly and violently. But if he wasn't, if even half of what he claimed was true, acting rashly could bring down their entire operation. The gang leader had built his criminal empire through careful planning and calculated risks. This situation felt like neither. 45 seconds, Miller continued. "Should mention that server I talked about. It's monitored by some old friends. The kind who get real interested when the upload sequence is triggered." His eyes, sharp despite his age, tracked the subtle movements of each gang member. The kind who can have a tactical team here faster than you'd believe possible. Tommy watched from his hiding spot, hardly daring to breathe. He knew about some, of Miller's preparations, had helped install some of the surveillance equipment himself, but even he wasn't sure how much of what the old farmer was saying was real and how much was an elaborate bluff. The teenager's hand still hovered near his phone, ready to dial the emergency number Miller had made him memorize. "Even if what you're saying is true," Marcus growled, his finger tight on his trigger, "you really think we'll just walk away? Leave all that evidence behind?" Miller's lips curved in what might have been a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Evidence is already gone. Everything I mentioned, it was uploaded hours ago, the moment your trucks turned onto my road. What's streaming now is just bonus material." He applied slightly more pressure to Ray's arm, causing the younger Davidson to gasp. 20 seconds. Dutch, the most experienced of the gang's enforcers, had been studying Miller's movements with growing concern. "Boss," he called out, his voice tight, "something ain't right here, the way he moves. I did 2 tours in Iraq. That ain't just military training, that's something else." 10 seconds, Miller announced. Sweat beaded on his forehead from the afternoon heat, but his hands remained steady, his breathing controlled. "Make your choice, Mr. Davidson. Walk away now, maybe salvage what you can of your operation, or—" He let the alternative hang in the air. A distant rumble of thunder rolled across the drought-stricken land, as if nature itself was providing a countdown. Marcus's eyes darted between his captive brother, his increasingly uncertain men, and the old farmer who had somehow turned their routine intimidation job into a tactical nightmare. 5 seconds, Miller said softly. "Remember James Fletcher? His last words were about his family's water rights, about promises made to keep the land flowing. Some promises run deeper than blood." The mention of Fletcher's final moments, something only those present could have known, broke Marcus's composure. "Stand down," he barked to his men. "Lower your weapons, now!" The gang members slowly complied, though their faces showed a mixture of confusion and relief. Only Viper kept his rifle partially raised, his loyalty warring with his instinct for survival. "All the way down, son," Miller called to Viper, his tone carrying the unmistakable authority of someone used to being obeyed in life-or-death situations. "Unless you want to explain to whatever's left of this outfit why you got their boss arrested over wounded pride." Viper's rifle finally lowered. Miller waited 3 more heartbeats, ensuring their compliance wasn't a feint, before smoothly releasing Ray's arm and stepping back. The younger Davidson scrambled to his feet, face red with pain and humiliation. "Your desert eagle's over there by the irrigation pipe," Miller informed Ray, gesturing with his now steady hand. "Careful picking it up. Like I said, rattlers love this weather." Marcus kept his own weapon pointed at the ground, but ready. "This isn't over, old man. Maybe we can't touch you directly, but a farm this size? Lots of things can go wrong. Equipment. Failures, mysterious fires." "True," Miller agreed, his posture relaxed but alert. "Course those friends I mentioned. They're real interested in asset protection these days. Lots of experience with it, overseas and domestic. Some of them owe me favors from back when we did things that never officially happened." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "Might want to look up the casualty rates for people who've tried interfering with their operations." A stronger rumble of thunder echoed across the valley. The storm that had been threatening all afternoon was finally approaching, promising rain for the parched earth. Miller's eyes remained fixed on Marcus, reading the calculations playing across the gang leader's face. "Load up," Marcus finally ordered, his voice tight with suppressed rage. "Ray, get your piece and get in the truck." His glare promised future retribution, but his instincts, the same instincts that had kept him alive through prison riots and gang wars, told him this was a battle they couldn't win. The gang members backed toward their vehicles, weapons still lowered but ready. Ray retrieved his Desert Eagle, cursing under his breath as he massaged his twisted shoulder. Only when they had all climbed into their trucks did Miller allow himself to release the combat breathing pattern he'd been maintaining. "This ain't over," Marcus called from the driver's window of the lead truck, "not by a long shot." "Yes," Miller replied quietly, his hands beginning to tremble again as the immediate danger passed. "It is. Because if I see you or your men within 50 miles of this farm again, what gets uploaded next won't be evidence for law enforcement. It'll be target packages for people who handle problems permanently." His voice carried the weight of someone who had compiled such packages before, who knew exactly how they were used. The truck's engines roared to life, kicking up clouds of dust as they executed a hasty retreat. Miller watched them go, his hands shaking more pronounced now as the combat focus faded. Behind him, he heard Tommy's cautious footsteps approaching from the barn. "Mr. Miller?" The boy's voice carried equal parts awe and concern. "Are you okay?" "I will be, son," the old farmer replied, his eyes still tracking the dust clouds disappearing down his access road. "I will be." The first drops of rain began to fall as Miller turned toward his farmhouse, his hands shaking more violently now that the immediate danger had passed. Tommy fell into step beside him, matching the old farmer's slightly limping gait. Behind them, thunder rolled across the valley like distant artillery, a sound that stirred memories Miller had spent years trying to suppress. "I need you to do something for me, Tommy," Miller said as they reached the porch. "Go to the back 40, check on that surveillance equipment we set up, make sure the rain doesn't damage anything." His voice was steady, even as his hands trembled, while unlocking the door. "But Mr. Miller," Tommy protested, "shouldn't I stay here in case they come back?" Miller shook his head. "They won't be back, not today. Men like that, they need time to lick their wounds, rebuild their confidence." He managed a tight smile. "Besides, I've got some calls to make, private ones." Tommy hesitated, then nodded, understanding that Miller needed space to process what had just happened. The boy had seen the change in the old farmer during the confrontation. The way the tremors had ceased, the fluid precision of his movements, the cold authority in his voice. Now, watching the shaking return worse than before, Tommy realized he was witnessing the cost of becoming that other person, even briefly. As Tommy's footsteps faded toward the back of the property, Miller entered his house and made his way to the master bedroom. The loose floorboard came up easily, revealing the shoebox containing his medals and documents. Beneath it lay a satellite phone, one that hadn't been activated in years. His trembling hands fumbled with the device before managing to power it on. The battery was still good. He changed it religiously every 6 months, just like he maintained all his emergency equipment. Old habits died hard, especially ones that had kept you alive in places that officially didn't exist. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. "I was wondering when you'd call, Ghost." The nickname brought a flood of memories. Nader's midnight operations in the Gulf, helicopter insertions into territory that wasn't supposed to have Americans in it, decisions made in seconds that haunted you for decades. "Mike," Miller acknowledged, sinking into his old rocking chair, "had to use some of those contingency plans we discussed." "I know," Mike Dawson replied. "Our mutual friends picked up the data burst from your farm. Pretty impressive surveillance. Operation you've been running. The company's already processing the intel." Miller's hands shook as he reached for the glass of water on his bedside table. "The Blackwater Gang won't take this lying down. They've got too much invested in their water theft operation. Too many powerful friends." "Let me worry about that," Mike assured him. "Those Chinese buyers they were meeting next week, already our people, been building a case against their entire network for months. Your intel was the missing piece we needed." A particularly loud thunderclap made Miller flinch, his trembling hands nearly dropping the phone. "Sarah always said I was paranoid," he said quietly. "Setting up all those security measures, maintaining equipment I hoped I'd never need again." Sarah was a smart woman, Mike replied. She knew what you were capable of. Why do you think she made you promise to protect the farm? Miller glanced at the photograph of his late wife on the dresser. Sarah, smiling, despite the cancer that was eating away at her, her hand resting on the farm's front gate. She knew, he agreed. Knew everything. About the missions, the ones that never made it into any report. About why my hands shake, except when I'm in combat mode. She understood what it cost to be what we were. What we still are, Mike corrected. Just because we're not in the field anymore doesn't mean we stopped being who we are. The skills, the instincts, they don't go away, they just wait until they're needed. Lightning illuminated the bedroom, casting stark shadows across Miller's military memorabilia. The tremors are worse this time, he admitted. Worse than they've been in years. They always are after you have to access that part of yourself, Mike said softly. Price we pay for being able to turn it on and off, but you did good, Sam. Clean operation, no casualties, mission accomplished. Miller's hand steadied slightly as he reached for a small wooden box on his nightstand. Inside was a worn challenge coin from his SEAL team, its surface scratched and dented from years of combat deployments. Had to protect the farm, he said, running his thumb over the coin's embossed surface. For Sarah, for the promise. And you did, Mike assured him. But the mission's not over. The Blackwater Gang is just part of a bigger operation. Water rights, illegal sales, political corruption. It goes deeper than you know. We could use someone with your skills, someone who knows the territory, who can operate under deep cover. Miller stared out his window at the rain, now falling steadily across his drought-stricken fields. The parched earth was soaking up the moisture, just as it had for generations. His family's legacy, Sarah's final request, all tied to this land. And the water flowing beneath it. I'm not that man anymore, Mike, he said, even as his hands began to steady with the prospect of a mission. I'm just a farmer trying to keep a promise. Are you? Mike's voice carried a knowing tone. Because the Sam Miller I knew, the one they called Ghost in the Gulf, he never stopped being a warrior. He just found a different kind of war to fight. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof like distant gunfire. Miller's hands moved to the wooden box again, this time withdrawing a small key that unlocked a hidden compartment in his closet. Inside was a laptop containing detailed files on water rights violations across 3 states, evidence he'd been gathering since Sarah's death. The gang's just the tip of the iceberg, isn't it? He asked, already knowing the answer. Tip of a very large, very dangerous iceberg, Mike confirmed, one that needs a ghost to help bring it down. Miller's hands had almost stopped shaking now, steadied by the familiar feeling of mission preparation. I'll need resources, support. Can't do this alone, not anymore. Already in motion, Mike replied. The company never really retired you. Ghost, we just put you in reserve, ready to be activated when the right mission came along. The storm had passed by evening, leaving behind the sweet smell of rain-soaked earth and the gentle drip of water from the farmhouse eaves. Miller sat on his front porch, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, watching Tommy return from checking the surveillance equipment. The boy's clothes were soaked, but his face showed the pride of completing an important mission. Everything's secure, Mr. Miller, Tommy reported, climbing the porch steps. The cameras are still transmitting, and I adjusted the satellite uplink like you showed me. He hesitated, then added, I also found something else. Fresh tire tracks. On the back road, maybe an hour old. Different from the gang's vehicles. Miller nodded, unsurprised. His hands steadied slightly as he set down his coffee cup. Black SUV? Government plates? Tommy's eyes widened. How did you... Mike works fast. Miller murmured, more to himself than the boy. Always did. He gestured to the porch chair beside him. Sit down, son. There's something we need to discuss. As Tommy took his seat, Miller studied the young man who had become more than just a farmhand over the past months. He saw in Tommy the same qualities he'd once seen in young operators under his command: dedication, attention to detail, and most importantly, the ability to keep a clear head in dangerous situations. "What you saw today," Miller began, his hands resuming their familiar tremor, "wasn't the whole story. Those men, the Blackwater Gang, they're part of something bigger, something that threatens more than just my farm." Thunder rumbled in the distance, a new storm building in the mountains. "The company I used to work for, they've been tracking a massive criminal operation. Water theft is just the surface. Below that, there's corruption, murder, international conspiracies, all built around controlling water rights across the Southwest." Tommy absorbed this information with the serious expression Miller had come to respect. "That's why you've been teaching me all those things: surveillance, communications, security protocols. You were preparing for something like this." "Preparing. You," Miller corrected, his trembling hands reaching for his coffee cup. "Sarah knew before she died that this fight was coming. Made me promise not just to protect the farm, but to use it as a base of operations. She understood what was at stake." A black SUV appeared at the far end of the property's main road, its headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. Miller watched its approach with the calculated awareness of someone who had spent years analyzing potential threats. But there was no tension in his posture. He'd been expecting this visit. "Tommy," Miller said, his voice taking on the crisp tone of command that had surfaced during the confrontation, "I'm about to have a meeting, one that could change everything. I want you to go home. But first, I need to know something." He turned to face the boy directly. "Are you ready for more than just helping around the farm? Ready to be part of something bigger?" The SUV was closer now, its government plates visible in the fading light. Tommy straightened in his chair, understanding the weight of the moment. "Like what you did before, in the military." Miller's hands steadied as he reached into his pocket, withdrawing a worn challenge coin. "Different kind of war, son, but just as important, maybe more so." He pressed the coin into Tommy's hand. "Take this home. Think about it. If you're in, come back tomorrow morning. If not," he shrugged, "farm always needs regular help too." The SUV pulled up to the house just as Tommy stood to leave. Two men in dark suits emerged, their movements carrying the unmistakable precision of specialized operators. The older of the two, his hair gray at the temples, smiled in recognition. "Ghost," he called out, using Miller's old call sign. "Been a while, Mike," Miller acknowledged, standing as Tommy slipped away through the gathering darkness. "Still wearing those government costumes, I see." Mike Dawson climbed the porch steps, followed by his younger companion. "Had to make it official. This time, this operation's too big for the shadows." He gestured to his colleague. "Agent Carter, CIA, he's running point on the international angle." Miller's hands had almost stopped shaking as he evaluated the younger agent. "Sarah's files," he said. "You've reviewed them?" Carter nodded, his expression grave. "Your wife was brilliant, sir. The evidence she gathered, the connections she made, it's the foundation of our entire case, but we need more." "Need a ghost," Miller supplied, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Someone who can move between the worlds of legitimate farming and covert operations. Someone with deep roots in the community, but the skills to handle wet work if necessary." "Someone exactly like you," Mike confirmed. "The tremors, they're perfect cover. Who'd suspect a shaking old farmer of being one of the most effective operators we ever fielded?" Miller's hands moved to the porch railing, gripping it as he stared out across his rain-soaked fields. In the distance, lightning flickered, illuminating the crops that were his visible legacy. But there was another legacy, one written in classified files and midnight operations, in promises made to a dying wife and obligations to a country that still needed ghost warriors. "Sarah knew," he said quietly. She knew you'd come eventually. That's why she made me promise, not just to protect the farm, but to use it, to become what I used to be, one last time. Mike stepped closer, his voice low and intense. Not just one last time, Ghost. This is a war, and wars need soldiers who know how to fight in the shadows. Your farm, your cover identity, they're perfect for what we need. The question is, are you ready to let the tremors stop again? Ready to become the operator you used to be? Miller's hands steadied completely as he turned to face his old friend. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. The slight shift in posture, the sharpening of his gaze, the precision that replaced the tremor in his movements. For a moment, both Mike and Agent Carter caught a glimpse of the legend they'd come to recruit. The Ghost never really retired, Miller said softly. He just found a different hunting ground. Dawn broke over Willow Creek Valley as Tommy Martinez pulled up to Miller's farmhouse in his battered pickup truck. The morning air was crisp with post-storm freshness, and puddles from yesterday's rain reflected the rising sun. In his pocket, the challenge coin Miller had given him felt heavy with significance. The black SUV was still parked near the house, its government plates collecting dew. Tommy found Miller in his usual spot on the porch, but the old farmer wasn't alone. Mike Dawson and Agent Carter sat with him, papers spread across a small folding table, their suits looking out of place against the rural backdrop. Miller's hands were steady as he marked locations on a large map, his movements precise and controlled. He looked up as Tommy approached, and something in his expression made the boy stand straighter. "You came back," Miller observed, though his tone suggested he'd expected nothing less. "Show me the coin." Tommy withdrew the challenge coin from his pocket, its surface catching the morning light. Miller nodded, then turned to Mike. "He's part of this. I've been training him for months, even if he didn't know it." Mike studied Tommy with experienced eyes. "The farm hand cover is perfect. No one questions a teenager helping around a farm. But are you sure he's ready for this level of operation?" "Tell them what you saw yesterday," Miller instructed Tommy. "The part about the gang's tactical positioning." Tommy swallowed hard but spoke clearly. "They made basic mistakes in their formation, didn't account for elevated firing positions, bunched up in predictable patterns. Their weapons handling was sloppy, fingers on triggers before they needed to be, poor muzzle discipline." Agent Carter raised an eyebrow, impressed. "You taught him tactical analysis?" "Sarah did, actually," Miller replied, his hands moving to arrange several photographs on the table. "She was teaching him about the farm's security systems before she passed. Said we needed someone young, someone who could carry on after—" His voice trailed off. "Your wife," Carter said carefully. "She was more than just a farmer's wife, wasn't she?" Miller's hands trembled slightly as he picked up a particular photograph. Sarah in her garden, smiling at the camera. 20 years in military intelligence before we met, specialized in pattern analysis and data correlation. She's the one who first noticed the suspicious water rights transfers, started mapping the connections. Mike leaned forward. "Which is why they really want this farm, isn't it? Not just for the aquifer, but because of what's Sarah hidden here." Miller nodded, his hands steadying again as he pulled out a worn leather notebook. This was her life's work. Every water right transfer in 3 states over the past decade. Every mysterious death, every suddenly wealthy county official, every shell company. She mapped it all. He turned to Tommy. "Remember those filing systems I had you memorize? The farm records we've been organizing?" Understanding dawned on Tommy's face. "That's why everything was coded. Why you made me learn those weird classification patterns." "Sarah's system," Miller confirmed. "Military-grade information organization disguised as agricultural record-keeping. She knew what was coming. Knew we'd need a way to track everything, without raising suspicions. Agent Carter studied the notebook with newfound respect. This is incredible. The level of detail, the connection mapping. This isn't just evidence. It's a complete blueprint of their operation. And now they're making their big move, Mike added, spreading out a new set of documents. Our intelligence suggests they're consolidating their holdings, preparing to sell water rights to foreign investors. Billions of dollars changing hands. Entire communities at risk of losing their water access. Miller's hands moved across the map, tracing routes and marking locations. The Blackwater Gang is just their muscle, their visible enforcers. The real power lies with a group calling themselves the Water Coalition. Corporate lawyers, corrupt officials, international financiers, all working together to control the most precious resource in the Southwest. Which is where we come in, Mike explained, looking at Tommy. We need people on the ground, people who can move freely in farming communities, gather intelligence, maintain surveillance operations, people who look completely harmless. Like a shaky old farmer and his teenage helper, Tommy said quietly, understanding dawning in his eyes. Miller stood, his movements fluid, despite his supposed infirmity. This isn't going to be easy or safe. What we're talking about, it's not just surveillance anymore. These people, they've killed to protect their operation. They'll kill again. But you've been preparing me for this, Tommy replied. All those lessons about observation, about maintaining cover stories, about emergency protocols. It wasn't just about farm security, was it? No, Miller admitted. Sarah saw something in you, same thing I did. The potential to be more than just a farmhand, to be part of something bigger. His hands were completely steady now as he placed them on Tommy's shoulders. But the choice has to be yours. Once you're in, there's no going back to being just a regular teenager. Tommy's hand closed around the challenge coin in his pocket. He thought about everything Miller had taught him over the past months, about Sarah's hidden files, about the larger war being fought in the shadows of his community. "When do we start?" he asked simply. Miller exchanged glances with Mike and Agent Carter before turning back to his protege. "We already have. Yesterday wasn't just about defending the farm. It was your first official operation. Your response, under pressure, your handling of the surveillance equipment, your tactical observations. You were being evaluated without knowing it. And?" Tommy asked, trying to keep his voice steady. A rare smile crossed Miller's face. "Sarah would have been proud. Welcome to the team, son." The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the farm as 4 people, a legendary operative, a veteran intelligence officer, a CIA agent, and a teenager who had just stepped into a world few knew existed, began planning their next moves in a war for the future of the American Southwest. Miller's hands remained steady as they marked targets and discussed operations, the tremors replaced by the precise movements of a warrior back in his element. The ghost was hunting again, but this time he wasn't alone. 3 weeks after the confrontation with the Blackwater Gang, Miller's farm had transformed into a sophisticated operations center hidden beneath its agricultural facade. The tremors in his hands came and went, depending on whether he was maintaining his cover as a struggling farmer or briefing his small team on mission details. "Satellite imagery confirms increased activity at their main compound," Miller announced, his steady hands manipulating a touchscreen display hidden behind a false wall in the barn. Tommy, Mike, and Agent Carter gathered around, studying the aerial photographs. Their moving equipment looks like preparing for a major operation. "Our sources indicate the Water Coalition is accelerating their timeline," Carter added, sliding several documents across the weathered work table. "The attempted takeover of your farm spooked them. They're worried about exposure." Tommy, who had spent the morning maintaining their surveillance equipment under the guise of repairing irrigation systems, pointed to a series of markings on the map. "These are all the properties they've acquired in the last month. They're creating a corridor controlling all the major water access points between here and the state line. Miller nodded approvingly at his protégé's analysis. Sarah's records show a pattern. They're not just buying land. They're securing strategic points that would allow them to control water distribution across the entire region. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up his wife's notebook, then steadied as he opened it to a marked page. She predicted this 3 years ago, called it the watershed gambit. Mike moved to the barn's window, checking their perimeter out of decades old. Habit. Ghost, we've got movement on the county road. Black SUV, no plates. Miller's transformation was instant. His hands began shaking more pronouncedly, his posture shifted to that of a weary farmer, and his voice took on the slight tremor they'd come to recognize as part of his cover. Tommy, farm chores. Carter, you know where to go. By the time the SUV pulled up to the farmhouse, the barn appeared to be nothing more than a typical agricultural building. Tommy was methodically checking irrigation pipes, while Miller stood in his front yard, his trembling hands fussing with a malfunctioning sprinkler head. The man who stepped out of the SUV wore an expensive suit that seemed impervious to the dust and heat. Mr. Miller, Richard Blackwood from the Regional Water Management Authority. His smile didn't reach his eyes. We need to discuss some irregularities with your water usage reports. Miller straightened slowly, playing up his apparent infirmity. Usage reports. Been filing the same paperwork for 20 years, Mr. Blackwood. Sarah used to handle it. God rest her soul. These days I do my best to keep up with the bureaucracy. Blackwood approached, his practiced smile still in place. Yes, your late wife. She was quite thorough with her record-keeping, wasn't she? There was an edge to his voice that made Miller's combat instincts surge, though his hands maintained their believable tremor. Sarah loved her files and figures, Miller replied mildly. Never could understand half of what she was writing about. Numbers weren't my strong suit, even before. He held up his shaking hands apologetically. Indeed. Blackwood's eyes scanned the property with poorly concealed interest. Our records indicate you're using significantly less water than your allotment allows. In these difficult times, the authority needs to ensure all resources are being utilized efficiently. There are many farmers who could make better use of your water rights. Miller noticed Tommy slowly working his way closer, maintaining his cover, but staying within support range. The boy had learned well. Just trying to get by, Mr. Blackwood. Don't need much these days, not since Sarah passed. Field's smaller than it used to be, but it's enough for one old man. Perhaps, Blackwood said smoothly, it's time to consider selling. The authority could offer you a very fair price, allow you to retire comfortably, somewhere less demanding. Miller's hands shook as he wiped sweat from his forehead with a worn bandana. Appreciate the offer, but I made a promise. Sarah's buried on this land, told her I'd keep it running. Admirable sentiment. Blackwood's tone hardened slightly. But sentiments don't pay bills, Mr. Miller, and my sources tell me you recently had some trouble with local elements, dangerous times for a man alone. The threat was clear, but Miller merely shrugged, maintaining his facade of harmless vulnerability. Good neighbors around here. Look out for each other. Speaking of which, he gestured toward the road, where 2 county patrol cars were turning. Onto his property right on schedule. Mike's planning was immaculate as always. The patrol cars pulled up just as Blackwood was reaching inside his jacket, presumably for business cards, but possibly for something else. The deputies who stepped out were actually undercover federal agents, but their presence served its purpose. Everything. All right here, Mr. Miller, the lead deputy called out. Noticed an unfamiliar vehicle during our patrol. Just fine, Deputy Jensen, Miller replied, his trembling hands adjusting his worn cap. Mr. Blackwood here was leaving, weren't you, sir? Blackwood's practiced smile returned, though his eyes had turned cold. Of course. Think about my offer, Mr. Miller. The authority can be very generous, or very persistent. As the black SUV disappeared down the dirt road, Miller's hands steadied once again. "Tommy," he called out, his voice returning to its command tone, "get the satellite feed for the last hour. I want to know where that vehicle came from and where it's going. Mike, Carter, we just met someone very high up in their organization. Time to start mapping his connections. The day's performance was over, and the real work could begin." The ghost was back on the hunt, and his prey had just shown its face. As Miller watched the sun set over his farm for the final time, his hands were completely steady. The operation had been a complete success. The water coalition was dismantled, its leaders arrested, and the stolen water rights returned to their rightful owners. The evidence Sarah had meticulously gathered, combined with Tommy's surveillance, work and the team's careful operations had brought down an organization that had threatened the entire Southwest's water supply. "You'd be proud, Sarah," Miller whispered, standing by her grave near the edge of their property. "The farm's safe now. The promise is kept." Tommy approached quietly, having learned to move like a ghost himself over the past months. "Mr. Miller, the team's ready for the final debrief." Inside the barn, Mike and Agent Carter were packing up the last of their equipment. The sophisticated command center would soon return to being just a simple farm building, its secrets known only to a select few. "The Water Coalition's foreign buyers have been identified and blacklisted," Carter reported. "Their political connections are being investigated. The Blackwater Gang's members are in custody. It's over." Miller's hands trembled slightly as he picked up Sarah's notebook one last time. "Not over," he corrected, "just changing. There'll always be people trying to control resources, trying to take what isn't theirs. That's why we've got to stay ready." "Speaking of ready," Mike added with a smile, "Tommy's training evaluation came back. Top marks across the board. The agency wants to fast-track him once he finishes school." Miller looked at his young protégé with pride. The boy who had once been just a farmhand had become something much more, a guardian, a protector, someone who could carry on the work Sarah had started. "The tremors," Tommy said quietly. "They're different now, aren't they?" Miller held up his shaking hands and smiled. "Not tremors anymore, son, just a reminder of who we were, who we are, and what we fight for." As the sun disappeared behind the mountains, Miller stood on his porch one last time, watching his team depart. His hands shook as he lifted his coffee cup, but it didn't bother him anymore. Some battles left visible scars, others left invisible ones, but it was what you did with those scars that mattered. The farm would continue, its water flowing freely, its secrets kept safe by a new generation of guardians. And somewhere in the shadows, the ghost would keep watching, ready to emerge whenever innocent people needed protection from those who would take what wasn't theirs. If this story touched your heart and you want to hear more tales of courage, redemption, and justice, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Tomorrow we've got another incredible true story that will leave you speechless. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload from us. Your support means the world, and it helps us keep bringing you these amazing stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Remember, sometimes the most dangerous people aren't the ones who look tough. They're the ones who've learned to appear harmless while carrying the strength of warriors within them. Until next time, stay safe and keep watching for more incredible stories of hidden heroes among us.